one of the most popular politicians in Latin America has been making some big waves lately. Nayib Bukele.
Nayib Bukele.
Nayib Bukele.
And lately, what Bukele's been receiving the most attention for is his tough approach on crime in El Salvador.
Voy a aprovechar la oportunidad para enviarle un mensaje a los criminales.
I'm going to take the opportunity to send a message to the criminals. There are rumors out there that they want to start taking revenge on honest citizens. Do that, and there will be no mealtime in the prisons.
Bukele has put in place effectively a state of emergency, called a state of exception in El Salvador, which suspends certain civil liberties in the country and makes it easier to arrest people.
The freedom to meet with whoever you want on the streets, the freedom to know why you're getting detained. It also increases the amount of time you can be detained.
That's my colleague Marcelo Rochabrun, one of Bloomberg's bureau chiefs in Latin America. And he says these kinds of security measures put in place under Bukele have resulted in a massive increase in the number of people being imprisoned in the country.
And what this has resulted in is an unprecedented wave of detentions. El Salvador is a small country, but its prison population has more than tripled in the past 22 months.
Since these security measures have gone into effect, the country's homicide rate has dropped by 84%, from what it was in 2018, the year before Bukele became president, up until now. But human rights advocates are raising the alarm about the conditions in the prisons where all these newly arrested people are being sent. And some Salvadorians think the plan has gone too far. Today on the show, how El Salvador's success in fighting crime has come at the expense of civil rights, and how Bukele's security strategy could impact his re-election campaign and inspire other leaders across the region to follow suit. I'm your host, Sarah Holder, and this is Big Take from Bloomberg News. Bukele came onto the national scene after serving as mayor in a small town and in the nation's capital. When he ran for president in his late 30s, he ran outside of the two-party system.
He's a politician who has built an identity really around this notion that he's different from the establishment.
That's Marcelo again.
He won with more than 50% of the votes. And he was young. He was 37 years old when he was elected. He was running on an anti-corruption platform.
Bukele took office in 2019, and he briefly gained some notoriety a couple years later in 2021 when he adopted Bitcoin as legal tender in the country.
President Nayib Bukele announced that El Salvador would be the first country to make Bitcoin an official currency.
Having gone to El Salvador, I can say that Bitcoin is definitely not widely used as a coin.
But things took a turn in 2022.
El Salvador vivió posiblemente los días más oscuros de los.
What changed everything was what happened in March 2022.
In a span of 2 days, dozens of people were killed by gangs. El Salvador went through its single most violent day since its civil war ended 30 years ago,
when 62 people were killed over a span of 24 hours.
Before this incident, gangs had been a regular part of daily life for people in El Salvador.
People had grown used to being extorted by gangs in El Salvador on a monthly basis or on a weekly basis, with recurring demands for payments, with demands for paying a bonus on Christmas to gang leaders.
And previous governments had tried different ways of dealing with them.
The relationship between political power and gangs in El Salvador dates back for years, and governments have tried different measures. One of them was called mano dura, which is translated into iron fist. Another one was like super mano dura, so like super iron fist. And it comes and goes, and negotiations have been long-standing between gangs. And so one thing that occasionally happens are truces between El Salvador's gangs, the two main ones being MS-13 and Barrio 18.
But after the high-profile deaths in March 2022, Bukele doubled down.
That is what triggered the idea that Bukele had to do something much more drastic than what any other government had done before. The way Bukele reacted as president was he demanded this state of exception. So in the case of El Salvador, it suspends the freedom to gather and meet for whatever reason. It suspends the privacy of communications between peoples. Your communications can either be read or heard by authorities without a warrant.
The state of exception was approved by Congress shortly after the 2022 massacre. and it led to a mass wave of arrests. One of the people who was arrested that year was a 22-year-old woman named Carla Michelle. Marcelo spoke to her father.
Mi nombre es Alfredo Mejía.
Alfredo lives in the outskirts of San Salvador. He's 60 years old. He owns a small photo studio in the commercial part of town. And he told Marcelo what he knew about the day Carla was arrested.
Ella salió con una amiga, acompañar a una amiga al centro, al Banco Agrícola.
He says Carla was accompanying a friend to the bank. Carla waited for her outside. And when Carla's friend came out to meet her, she was gone.
Vigilante le dijo, muchacha, acaban de detener a su amiga. La amiga llama y dice, detuvieron a Carla.
He says a security guard had seen her get arrested, and the friend called Alfredo and his wife to let them know. They had no idea why she'd been arrested. But when Alfredo called their local police precinct, they told him it was just going to be a 15-day investigation, and then Carla would be free. That was 19 months ago.
Y hasta la fecha, y todavía no la hayan investigado.
Carla is still being held, and Alfredo says the only thing he's been told is that she was arrested for not carrying an ID. And Marcelo says the situation Alfredo's daughter is in is not uncommon. Because under the state of exception, not only were certain civil liberties suspended, like the ability to gather in public at certain times, it also
suspends the right of being informed for the reason for an arrest and of having a lawyer, if you wish. It also extends the amount of time that you can be detained without any kind of judge involvement.
So without any clear legal path to get his daughter out of prison, Alfredo started looking online for answers.
He started on Facebook groups and WhatsApp groups, and it became clear to Alfredo that this was not just an isolated incident, that it was not just his daughter who had been detained. And he started connecting with other parents who were looking for their missing children.
Since her arrest, Alfredo has started a small NGO for family members who have had someone be abruptly arrested under the current security measures. It's called Movir.
And they say they don't represent any person whose children have been detained, that they make sure to ask for all the facts of the case to ensure that they are not defending somebody who may have been detained for belonging to a gang, but only defending people who have been detained innocently.
After the break, we go inside one of El Salvador's newest prisons, and we hear about how the so-called Bukele plan is spreading across Latin America. Hey, we're back. Before the break, we were talking about the thousands of new arrests under El Salvador's state of exception. And all of these new arrests have created a problem for the country's prison system, which has quickly become overcrowded. In the summer after the deaths in 2022, Bukele began building a mega prison called the Sicot.
It is one of the biggest prisons in the world, and it has a capacity for 40,000 people. And we visited this prison, which is indeed brand new.
In video footage of the prison, some of it published by the government, rows and rows of shirtless men kneel on the ground. Their heads are bowed.
It is currently only holding 12,000 inmates. That means that the remaining would be 88,000 prisoners in El Salvador are being held in the old jails, in the same jails that were already crowded before the state of exception. And those prisons are much harder to get into.
And what's happening inside those prisons has become a source of concern in the country.
Human rights organizations in El Salvador say they have heard thousands of claims of abuse in these prisons. In particular, Cristosal, one of the human rights organizations most active in El Salvador, has documented 215 deaths so far in prisons during the state of exception. We asked the government about these numbers. We asked their security minister, Gustavo Villatoro, directly how many people have actually died in prisons in El Salvador.
Ya, no te puedo dar un número.
And he wouldn't say.
En todas las cárceles alrededor del mundo se mueren prisioneros por temas de enfermedad, por temas de... Hay un sinfín.
He said that prisoners die for many reasons in every part of the world.
¿Ya? ¿Qué es lo que tenemos que evitar? Que una o alguna de esas...
He said they try to avoid having prison personnel be responsible for any deaths, and that giving a number would play into the interests of NGOs. For Salvadorians, this state of exception has been complicated. On one hand, there are accusations that the government has gone too far and arrested people who are not guilty of any crime. And there are reports of widespread abuse and deaths inside the prisons. On the other hand, the country's homicide rate is lower than it's been in decades. We asked Marcelo how people are holding these conflicting realities in their minds.
It's different to talk about gangs while living surrounded by gang activity than to talk about them from the outside, right? This idea that you have a state of exception which suspends civil liberties, which is true, is one thing on paper, and it's another thing on the ground. You're suspending right of assembly, the right to go out, but people in territories controlled by gangs will tell you that they don't have that freedom to begin with. So whether the government suspends it or not does not impact necessarily the freedom that they have. That is why we see in different countries in Latin America these attitudes where people feel that the government should be able to encroach more on civil rights in the name of security. And they point to El Salvador as sort of a successful example. There are many caveats to that, but a very important one is how long can that go on for? How long is it healthy to give the government so much power? It has been extended for a long time, and it does make a lot of people wonder if this is sort of the new reality, the new normal. We're talking about 22 months and counting.
And while the people of El Salvador grapple with this tension, Bukele's moves are being watched closely by other leaders around the region.
One of the things that we've seen in Latin America recently is a rising gang violence throughout the region. And the one nation buckling that trend is El Salvador. So that has led to Bukele's profile rising in the region. A couple of examples that we've seen very recently, for example, is Ecuador, where gangs have been terrorizing the country lately. Just this year, they took over a TV station, and President Daniel Noboa of Ecuador has all but declared a war with gangs. And one of the things that he has said is that he needs to build new prisons, and that the prisons that he's going to build are going to be very similar to what Bukele has built in El Salvador.
Entonces, para todos los Bukele lovers, es una cárcel igualita. Si quieren ir, pasear.
Peru, where I'm based, mayors in Lima, the capital, mayors of different neighborhoods of the capital have been demanding that the president adopt Bukele-style measures.
These measures are often referred to as the Bukele plan. And Bukele himself seems to be aware of its popularity.
At one point, Bukele even tweeted a poll asking if the Bukele plan should be implemented in Peru, and more than 90% of the people answering this poll said yes.
As for Bukele, he's up for re-election.
So the election is on Sunday, February 4th. And the polls indicate that Bukele is going to win by a landslide and just absolutely crush his competition. Depending on how you measure the voting, it could be as high as Bukele obtaining 70% of votes while his rivals don't even scratch 5%. He's really one of the most popular politicians in the world right now. And at the same time, Salvadorians are very happy with the state of their democracy. There's this organization in Latin America, Latino Barometro, that measures the health of democracies across the region. Usually it asks people what they think of their democracy. And the single country where its citizens are most satisfied with their democracy right now is in El Salvador.
But Marcelo notes that when you look at other indicators, the state of El Salvador's democracy can look very different.
When you look at other indicators, such as The Economist, for example, famously has a democracy index. And the democracy index in El Salvador has been falling since Bukele became president. And in fact, El Salvador, under The Economist ranking, ranks among the weakest democracies in the region. So you have this thing, right, where outside observers say that the democracy in El Salvador is very weak. But you also have a majority of citizens of El Salvador who say that they're very satisfied with the state of their democracy. So there is definitely a paradox there.
Thanks for listening to Big Take from Bloomberg News. I'm Sarah Holder. This episode was produced by Adriana Tapia and Gilda DeCarli. It was edited by Caitlin Kenny and Brendan Walsh. It was mixed by Blake Maples. It was fact-checked by Tiffany Choi. Our senior producers are Naomi Shavin and Gilda DeCarli. We get editorial direction from Elizabeth Ponso. Nicole Beamsterboer is our executive producer. Sage Bauman is our head of podcasts. Special thanks to Marcelo Rochabrun for his reporting. Thanks for tuning in. We'll be back tomorrow.